All right, welcome to Module 3. We're going to jump right in here, start talking about some police processes, the organizational structure, and some police practices. All right, so this week we're going to dig into what some police organizational structures look like and how the organizational structure of a police department is going to influence how the agency operates. That will also kind of feed into the organizational culture, command and management, what we mean by those terms, and some different terms associated with that supervisory role. Areas of responsibility, what is an officer in different ranks within law enforcement, and what does each of the ranks do? And then we'll talk briefly about some time management concerns in law enforcement. So when we look at organizational hierarchies or organizational structures within law enforcement, there's going to be a lot of deviations based on how the agency is, the size of it, the different types of bureaus or divisions that it might have. But this is a good example. This is using the Washington State Patrol. This is from 2016, but it's unchanged in to 2023 where we're at now. What you'll see, the CEO, the chief executive officer, the chief of the agency is going to be situated at the top. And then again, there might be some nuanced differences, but it's going to have separation by division or bureau or by geographic locations. It's going to basically segment out through a chain of authority down into different work groups. So here for the State Patrol, you'll see that there's a Field Operations Bureau, which is your troopers working the road. Commercial Vehicle Enforcement Bureau, those are individuals responsible for enforcing vehicle weight, size, load restrictions, port of entries for the semi trucks coming in and operating within Washington State. The Fire Protection Bureau, they certify and inspect the fire systems in like nursing homes, retirement homes, hospitals, as well as there's the Fire Training Academy, which is responsible for providing an academy for all firefighters in the state of Washington. Forensic Laboratory Services Bureau, they handle all of the crime lab, CSI investigations, toxicology lab. Anytime there's a blood draw or any type of drug substance that needs to be tested and identified, that's the type of work that they do. And the impaired driving section, they manage the breath test equipment that is operated for not only the State Patrol, but for all law enforcement in Washington State. Investigative Services Bureau, that's where the detectives and more of the specialty investigative units are housed within that bureau. And then the Technical Services Bureau really is civilian heavy, a lot of communications officers, electronic services, the hiring folks at human resources, information technology, maintaining computer systems and softwares and servers, risk management, and then the training division. So this may be different based upon, again, the size of the agency or department, but there's going to be a basic hierarchical structure similar to military. And then we're going to go in here and look at how does this structure have some strengths, some pros, some cons or challenges, and then is this the future of law enforcement, or is there going to be a different type of structure potentially that offers better benefits? So organizational structure strengths, when you look at the paramilitary chain of command structure that we just looked at for the State Patrol, for most police departments in America, there's a very rigid chain of command. And that can be both a strength and it can be a con against it, in that you have to seek approval at the next rank for certain things, and that could be some delays, but it also allows for a very clear delineation of roles and responsibilities so that everybody knows if you have a situation, what level of approval is needed and whose responsibility it is to make that decision. Specialization, as you saw, there's very specific tasks and roles and responsibilities that are defined not only in the structure but by work group. So it allows for high degrees of specialization. So if you had, for instance, a high-tech crime unit, you know that they are going to be housed within a specific bureau and then have their own division and then have a section. And that allows for highly specialized work units to operate within a very large, complex agency. Delegation of authority, also because of the chain of command, it is easy for, if someone within that chain of command is taking vacation, or if they need to delegate authority and have someone step in and perform a function or a role, it's easy to do because it's kind of the next man up principle, where they typically are training the person below their rank how to do their job, so that when there is any absence of a person in that spot, you have some depth in the bench. You have you want to avoid a single point of failure. So the delegation of authority allows the organization to continue in the absence of any one of those chains within the chain of command. So now we'll take a look at some of the organizational structure challenges. And anybody who's spent any time working in a government job knows that there's a lot of slow decision-making processes that can happen. When you have to seek approval at a higher rank, or maybe that decision has to go to 2 or 3 ranks above the line worker, that can allow for a very slow decision-making process. Heavy levels of bureaucracy. When you have large agencies with very complicated organizational structures, it can really complicate things where, yes, it does allow for a high degree of specialization, but let's take the state patrol for example. If there's a vacancy in a position, instead of just being able to go fill that position, there is a series of requests and approvals and forms that need to be filled out, because the one division that has the vacancy, let's say it's a detective unit, they have to seek approval. So there's multiple levels of approval to be able to get authorization to fill that. Then there's coordination that has to happen with that detective unit to the human resource division. So now you're working with a completely different division with a completely separate chain of command to work through an advertisement, a interview process, selection process. Then there's the reporting process, where if a trooper is selected to be promoted to that detective rank, now you have 2 different division commanders that have to agree on a report date and when that assignment will begin. So the heavy levels of bureaucracy can really slow down the wheels of progress within an agency, really of any size, but particularly of a large agency or an agency with lots of different levels of hierarchy. So that can be a very large challenge for agencies. Poor communication. Anytime you have more than one person involved, you have opportunities for poor communication. This is only expanded again when you look at multiple rank structures, divisions, different sections. Just communicating in general can become difficult. Then insert different personalities, different goals and objectives. That competition can create really poor and challenging communication strategies. And then you have divisional rivalry. Anybody who's ever worked in like a team environment can understand this. If you have different divisions and you're all competing for the same resource, which in any agency there's limited funds available, and if you are competing for the same resource, that can create a lot of friction within the one agency. An example could be in a police organization. You might have a SWAT team commander that wants to purchase a new armored vehicle. And if anybody doesn't know, those are extremely expensive. And you might have another commander who wants to purchase new laptops for their patrol officers. Also expensive, when you factor in that might be a large number. So now you have some challenges because the same pot of money is the only allotment that the agency gets, and you have these competing tasks and priorities, and so that can create a lot of friction internally just in trying to compete for those resources. So hopefully that example is easy to follow and you might be able to relate to that in whatever kind of job or past experience you have. So when we consider, most law enforcement agencies are that paramilitary structure, which the military structure, chain of command, you have to seek out approval at a certain level, really for any decision to be made. And when we look at and consider what's the future or ideal organizational structure for law enforcement, there's a lot of pressure and changes that are occurring, especially in smaller departments where they're transitioning more to a business-based model where that they can delegate down authority to the line level for a lot of decisions, and so you're empowering your employees to make more decisions, which if you're an employee and you've been delegated the ability to make certain decisions, generally speaking, that's going to improve morale because you feel like you have more control over some of the functions of your daily job. When we look at employee engagement, time and time again, when employees are surveyed, one of the largest areas that's deficient is employees don't feel like they have a voice or that their decision making ability carries any weight. So, an organizational structure that will actually engage employees and ask them questions and then actually respond accordingly um, doesn't necessarily happen in most paramilitary style structures. So it's really top down, and there's not a lot of opportunity or even built into the organizational structure to go out and seek advice or opinions or input from the employees in a hierarchical organizational structure. So changing that paradigm and actually soliciting information from the ground level and then having that influence what the chief is going to decide, that can be a huge change in how the organizational structure is currently operating in most law enforcement agencies. So that again, employee engagement and employee morale are kind of joined at the hip, where if the employee is feeling valued and like their decision actually matters, that's going to help them feel like, hey, my ideas are being listened to. I actually am contributing to the value of the organization. They're more likely to stay as an employee. Then, when we look at community services and community engagements, when you look at the state patrol or really any police department's organizational structure, there is no space for like a community liaison or any kind of community input, which is challenging when police agencies are formulated and provided, funding by taxpayers. So how does the society, the community, have any say in what they want from their police department? So as we kind of consider and just talk about what's the future of policing and police structures, a lot of departments are integrating into their hierarchy some sort of a community group or community committee that will offer that feedback. And they may not have like organizational authority in directing how the department will do certain things, but they at least have a voice and an opportunity to provide that input. And then that can be considered by the chief and by the command structure, and then they can influence change. So that's important to just know that the current structures of most law enforcement agencies don't include that, but it could be something in the future that you see more widely. So we'll talk about organizational culture for a minute, and we can, if we just look at organizational culture outside of law enforcement, it's pretty easy to see differences. Let's take, for example, Chick-fil-A. If you go to a Chick-fil-A restaurant and you are going to order some food, you have a general idea, if you've ever been to one, what kind of customer service that you're going to receive. Similarly, if you've ever had a flat tire and you've gone to a Les Schwab, you have a general idea that you're going to be met generally pretty quick with someone with a positive attitude. Let's change that or consider, for instance, a different type of company, probably any type of TV, cable, or internet service provider. Let's say you have a problem with their service and you call the 1-800 number you have a general idea of what level of service you're going to receive, right? So we think about that. Why are those different agencies or companies so different? And that's where you start to see organizational culture, has a huge influence in what your experience as a customer is going to be. So we can apply that same kind of concept to organizational culture into law enforcement. And really, the components of what builds an organizational culture is what we're looking at here on this slide. So you have the philosophy, and really all of these components are set at that CEO, that chief lead officer for the agency, whether that's law enforcement or if that's in the civil service business world. So your CEO is going to set the philosophy. They're going to set the agency on a course. They're going to determine what are the core values of the organization. They're going to determine what the mission is. What are we here to do every day? What do we want the employees to be focused on? And what do we determine to be our expectations? Closely aligned to that is the vision. Ideally, if everything goes our way, if we're successful in everything that we endeavor to do, what's the vision? What will the future look like? Setting expectations then to help achieve the mission and the vision, and then also creating like a level of tolerances. So if we have an employee that has a mistake, they didn't mean to do something, what level of tolerance do we have for that? And what kind of disciplinary structures and processes do the agency put in place to correct that? So tolerances can mean a lot of different things. When we look at law enforcement, it can be as simple as if somebody on a traffic stop was rude to the violator, some agencies will tolerate that. Other agencies will not tolerate an act of discourtesy, and that alone would start the employee on some sort of a corrective action plan. And so you can see very quickly that tolerance levels can have a huge impact overall in what the organizational culture looks like. So we'll go into each one of these, the strengths and challenges within the organizational culture more so that we can get a better idea of what we're talking about. So organizational culture, as we talked about, it has a huge impact on what tolerances the agency is going to allow for, but it spills over into all of these other areas, right? The culture really will dictate what kind of communication strategies are used within the agency. Just really like how does an employee talk to another employee or talk to their supervisor? We already talked about core values. By that, what is the code of ethics that are going to be acceptable within the organization, or are there even any core values? A sense of unity. Does an employee working for the organization feel like they're all in lockstep with their members, their peers? A sense of community is very closely tied to that unity. Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they're valued? That connection, is there a feeling of connectedness, or are you just another number at the agency? There's no connection, there's no feeling or reward in the work that's being done. That bleeds over into organizational norms. We can all think back to any place that you've ever worked. There's maybe the policy that says you should do this, but there's the organizational norm which may differentiate from what the policy says. And that organizational norm is what the employee is going to actually do. There's a number of examples I can think of previous employers where you're being trained as a new employee and they might say something like, well, this is what the book says, but this is how we really do it. Or nobody does it that way, we only do it this way. That is very powerful because the organizational norms are the culture of the organization. And culture is going to drive what the employees actually do, which hopefully is the same thing as what the agency's purpose is. The culture and the mission of the agency both going to serve the same purpose. And that can be different within different agencies. You have some cultures that are contradictory to the purpose of why the organization exists. So all of these areas, you can think about your own personal experiences where I think if you've spent any time in the workforce, where you can think of an organizational norm might have been contrary to the purpose for why that organization existed. So, challenges. Obviously, there's a great number of success stories where the organizational culture is congruent to the mission. What I want to focus on, though, for this slide and for this discussion is what happens when the organizational culture is not good, where you're an organization that is allowing groupthink, that stifles, innovation. And we have some examples here of really extreme examples, I would say. You have World War II, Nazi Germany, where clearly you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are going along with, whether they believe it or not, they're going along with some horrible, um, not even just ethical violations, but just humanitarian violations. And so they didn't obviously feel like they could speak up. And there was a great deal of fear in change. But that's the dangers when we look at this of groupthink. So if we look over to the right, and we see this time and time again across police agencies, across any organization that you can think of, where a supervisor might propose an idea and everyone else in the committee or the boardroom is just going to go along with it. Even if they think it's a horrible idea, they're not going to have, they don't believe that they have the ability to speak up and to speak up against it. And so some of the reasons why, organizational cultures fail is because of the groupthink. They either all just think of exactly the same thing because there's no diversity. They don't have any different life experiences or lived experiences. Or they fail to speak up because either the culture is that they don't listen to any ideas or innovation, or potentially the supervisor just is harsh and won't listen to it or shoots it down. There may not be anonymity, where that can go kind of cut both ways. Either you feel like you're just a number and you're anonymous, and so therefore you're not really dedicated or have any invested interest in it, or you feel like you need that anonymity before you would speak up because you're worried about the reprisal. If I speak up, I'm going to get punished in some way or I might get fired. So it can cut both ways. Excuse me. And there's also a fear of change. That could be the organization. It could also be just the employees, the culture. Maybe there is no change that comes to the organization or hasn't in years. And so there's just a general fear and resistance of change. Any one or all of these things can really create a difficult organizational structure for the employees, for the agency as a whole. And then when we look at a public police agency, what at the end of the day is happening to the community? If this is the culture of your law enforcement agency, are the people that are getting calling 911 for help, are they going to get served well? Probably not, because they probably are just going to follow whatever the cultural norm is of the agency for that type of call, and they're not going to do anything different. So this can be very dangerous when we look at a law enforcement agency, and we want to ensure that a police agency, the culture, is focused and the culture supports the focusing on the victim and doing a thorough investigation that's impartial, that's transparent. So that's where an organizational culture can be very difficult if there's not a CEO or a chief that is taking pulse and checking the temperature of the culture to make sure that the culture is running in the exact same direction that they want their mission and vision and their goals to be going towards. So we talked about this a little bit earlier when we started talking about the culture. What does the future look like? And if we are in the community policing or problem solving era of policing, then ultimately we want to be working towards the community policing as our goal. And so we're going to then have to have a culture that welcomes collaboration and innovation and stakeholder engagement. And what do we mean by stakeholder engagement? Well, there's lots of different stakeholders when you look at a community. You have obviously the citizenry that lives in the community, but less obvious, you have businesses, you have religious groups, you have political action groups, you obviously have the government, you have, it might be a mayor or a city council, which have obviously their own objectives and goals. You have different schools, hospitals. All of those entities are going to want something from the police and probably something different from the police. If you're single living in an apartment, you might want one thing from the police. It might change over time when you get married, have kids, and you're now living in the suburbs. Your goal or your vision of the police and what the police role might also change. If you are living in a high crime area, a neighborhood that your car keeps getting vandalized, broken into, your expectation of policing is going to be even more different. If you keep getting a speeding ticket driving through a school zone, your view of community policing might be also something very different. Same thing if you're a business owner, your business might be getting vandalized, or you might have an employee who stole from you. You can see how quickly stakeholder engagement is extremely valuable, because all of those different entities are going to come together, and they might have some similar needs and desires, but they might also have some very diverse views towards policing. But when you have a way of introducing all of the different perspectives, that can be helpful in that collaboration and also the innovation. How do you then deploy your limited police forces into the community to make a meaningful difference in what the community actually wants to see from their police? That might shift over time, where maybe you need to have more investigators, you need to have more detectives, because the types of cases that are occurring require more ongoing investigations and in-depth looking to find who your suspect is that's that prolific car thief. Or it might change to, we have a really big speeding problem, and that's causing a series of collisions, and so the community is not safe, and we need to maybe look at how some of the roads are engineered and make some changes that way. But that's where hopefully the future of policing is headed, where the organizational culture will collaborate with the community, with its own officers, to get a better idea of what does the police department need to be doing. So law enforcement, unfortunately, has had several examples of when the culture fails and when the agencies fail. Obviously, it's specific individual officers that make the poor decisions, and they're ultimately responsible for their actions. But when we are considering the organization, we have to also question what was the culture of that agency. So we look at Rodney King in Los Angeles in '91, George Floyd, and Tyree Nichols. You have to question, was there things within the culture that led to these series of events? And so we kind of look at the illustration to the right, where obviously policy says one thing, and those are regulations, and within policy you also have the accountability. But that's where we get into tolerances. What was the culture for tolerances and the adherence to policy? uh, on the right, you see culture is really driven by leadership, what the practice is of the agency, and the priorities. So, was in the Rodney King example in Los Angeles Police Department back in the 90s, was there strong leadership? Were they actively practicing treating all citizens with respect and dignity? Was that their priority? You have to question that. If the culture of the agency was practicing treating every citizen contact with a high degree of dignity and humanity and respect, would the events of Rodney King have happened? Maybe, but probably not. If the cultural norms were that we have a high value of every citizen that we contact, and we're going to treat them with respect and recognize that they're all, members of our community, and we're here to protect them and serve them, then your attitude during that contact would be different. When you look at the case of George Floyd, arguably one of the most famous cases of recent history, and then there's a lot of controversy as was the knee on his neck or on his back. You can debate that, but was the officer treating George Floyd with a high degree of dignity and respect? Was he looking out for him as a person? I think when you look at that, there's a resounding no. And is that reflective then of the culture of that agency, where other officers, they clearly had opportunities to step in and to treat Mr. Floyd with a higher level of respect and dignity? And I'm not pointing fingers to any one, group of people, but the leadership of the agency had a duty to instill within the department a practice of treating people with respect. And I don't know, but it would be interesting to see what the other citizen contacts were of the officers involved in that case over time. I think that most people, they join law enforcement because they want to help community, they care about people, they want to actually make the world a better place. So what happened from when they joined into the agency with that heart to the illustration that you see on the slide, where you're just kneeling on somebody, holding them down? That probably wasn't the same, servant heart that wanted to have a career in law enforcement. So was it, a series of events that he experienced during his career, or was it some acclamation to the culture within the agency? It could be both. I think, probably a combination of the two is likely, but clearly the culture is winning out in some of these agencies. They look at the most recent Tyree Nichols in Tennessee. Again, there you have a group of officers all behaving in the same basic way. So it begs the question, what's the culture of the agency? Does the leadership have their priorities in the right place, and are they practicing that? And is that not congruent with what their policy and the regulations are? Because clearly there's a lack of accountability when you can have that kind of a situation occur and the officers don't seem to be doing anything to upset the cultural norms, at least on the video that's publicly available. So important in the discussion when we look at culture and how important culture is, but culture can really fail law enforcement, and unfortunately in these examples in a very public way that damages the perceptions and expectations that the society has for its police officers and for its departments. All right, we're going to change gears now. We talked about how the organizational structure can have some benefits and some challenges, and how the structure can complement or maybe it sometimes hurt the culture. But let's look at now just what is the ranks and the command levels within most police agencies. So we'll start with just the general police officer. Obviously, some agencies have even a previous step. You could be an explorer or a cadet. You might have some kind of on-the-job training level prior to being a commissioned police officer. But we'll start here with the police officer. So you have your line officer that's going to go to traffic stops and do that line of work. Then you have, at most agencies, a corporal rank. For the state patrol, that's the rank of someone that works at the academy and they do training. Other departments, a corporal might be kind of like a shift supervisor. They might have some training or low level of supervision expectations. In a lot of departments, a detective rank is a promotion. So they might receive additional training, additional pay, obviously additional responsibilities and assignments there. The sergeant level is almost uniformly the first line level supervisor rank. They're responsible for supervising, a detachment or a unit of officers or detectives, or that might also include the corporal. But they're going to be doing line function supervision. Above a sergeant, you generally will have the lieutenant rank, which will have typically a series of detachments or a number of sergeants underneath them, and even more officers that would be supervised by the sergeant. Above the lieutenant, you might see some majors or captain ranks, but they will have then typically a couple lieutenants, 2, 3, 4 lieutenants, and be in charge of a division or a larger section of the organization. Depending, again, now the size of the agency, if it's a large agency, more than 40, 50 people, you might see an assistant chief or deputy chief rank. In the State Patrol, there's 5 assistant chiefs. Currently, there's no deputy chief, and then you have the chief. In most smaller agencies, there may not be an assistant chief. There might just be a captain or a lieutenant and then the chief. So a lot of that rank structure is very flexible. But basically, in the assistant or deputy chief roles, they might be doing a lot more of the day-to-day operations, and then the chief is really the figurehead. They would be the signatory on contracts and purchasing of large equipment items. And then there's a lot of speaking engagements, public appearances. But the chief or the CEO of any agency should be setting the vision, the long-term strategic goals of the organization. Again, like we talked about, checking the pulse of the culture, making sure that the agency is moving in the right direction and making those adjustments over time. So that's just the types of ranks that exist. Some departments, they will change the names. You might have, instead of chief, you might have commanders. Instead of a captain, you might have a commander. You might have just different types, like majors, sergeant major, a lot of different names, but the rank structure generally would be the same throughout the country. So as we kind of continue our discussion about command, we'll often hear, command and control and management and supervision. So command and control, if you think about it, you're really focusing on a scene or a specific incident. You're talking about command and control of that one operation. And really, to help kind of illustrate that, we have this incident command structure using the ICS, which is recognized by FEMA as being really the ideal command structure for completing any kind of incident management. So you have your incident commander there at the top, but you're also going to have different sections. So you'll see there's operations section, planning, logistics, finance. So operations is where all of the actual work is going to get done at the operational level, and you're going to have subgroups that are going to be delegated to do specific tasks or things. So when we talk about the command and control, any incident or scene needs to have a scene commander, an incident commander, somebody in charge that's going to make all of the decisions for the tactics, the strategy, the duration, what the location of events, and how that's going to work. If you don't have a commander, then you have disorganization, and that can really devolve into chaos. So when we talk about command and control, just know that we're talking about really specific to one incident or one scene and the control of that operation. So span of control, when you'll probably hear that term as well. In law enforcement and in most businesses, the span of control is ideally limited to that 8 to 10. So if you had a sergeant, below that sergeant, you wouldn't want more than about 8 or 10 officers to report to that one sergeant. And then similarly, you wouldn't want one lieutenant to supervise more than 8 to 10 sergeants. because as that starts to build, as you look at the command structure, it can grow to be unmanageable. So the ideal span of control that's universally accepted is that 8 to 10 per one supervisor. And again, that really is dependent upon what types of tasks and operations you're talking about. If it's highly technical, you might need to lower that number down. If it's something that's less critical, less risky, that number can grow. But as a general rule, that 8 to 10 is where you want to stay. So to kind of illustrate the command and control idea or that concept, here's another illustration of what we mean by command and control. So they're going to be in charge and directing personnel, equipment, dictating what procedures are going to be happening. And that's going to feed then down into the actual process of doing whatever that task is. So you see some pictures around. A lot of departments will have a mobile command, so they might have an RV or a trailer or something like that. But a command post is essential because they need to be located somewhere close enough to get the information to make those timely decisions, and also close enough to the work so that they understand what the resources are, what the demands are, what the challenges are for the scene, depending on weather conditions. If it's hazmat, those types of things can change quickly if the wind shifts directions. So you need to have a command post relatively close to the scene, but obviously not in the scene. Command and control, if the scene commander doesn't understand their roles properly, if they get too engaged in the actual scene, then they're not going to see the larger picture. They may miss a lot of the information that would help make better decisions. So as a commander, when you're talking about command and control, you have to know what the ideal role is for that commander. You're going to direct resources, but you shouldn't be functionally doing any of the tasks that you're trying to oversee and command. So kind of a general rule of thumb is you should be outside the crime scene tape if it's a crime, and be directing resources from within the scene, but not actively involved in it yourself, if that makes sense. If you ever see a commander of any kind of incident and they're actually in the scene and they're doing any of the investigative work themselves, somebody needs to come up to them and pull them out because they've gotten too focused, too involved, and they're going to start missing things. If you're actively working within the scene, you're probably not thinking about when are these resources going to be exhausted. What are the next operational cycles going to look like? Do we have staffing? Is there scene security that needs to be relieved? What does the refreshments look like for if this is going to be a scene that's going to be here for 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week? What does that relief look like? Those are the type of larger picture things that the commander should be looking at down the road, not only just in the moment. So hopefully that kind of helps illustrate the command and control as we were referring to it in this context, what the mission is that large, 30,000 foot view. We have to achieve all of these small objectives to get to a mission accomplished status. So command and control then is very different than management. We talk about management. There's scene management, which I would categorize with command and control. That's really the function of that incident. But when we're talking about law enforcement management, that is a different type of skill set, and it uses a lot of different processes than what an incident command and control will focus on. So management, when we're talking about it in the context of law enforcement, police management, really here you're talking about long-term setting of goals and objectives for the department, for your unit, or for the individual officer. And when you're considering those goals and objectives, you're going to establish performance measures and management practices that are ultimately going to help you get to whatever your end state, that desired end state. If it's to reduce collisions or stop or lower the number of drug overdose deaths in your community. That's a goal and objective. And you're going to then develop performance measures and management practices for your work unit or whatever resources you have to reach that objective. So that's when we're talking about management and policing, really what we're talking about. So setting of goals and objectives, identifying strategies, then specific tactics that are going to help you get to making progress on whatever your goals and objectives were. And then you're continually, as a manager, making adjustments. You have to evaluate, is our strategies and tactics, are they being successful? Are they making changes? We benchmarked where we were. Are we making progress towards the direction that we want to be going? And if you're not, then you need to make adjustments to, hey, maybe our goals and objectives were too high. Maybe they were unrealistic. So you might have to go all the way back to the drawing board and change your goals and objectives, or maybe it's just our strategy is missing because we didn't consider that the community was going to respond this way. So we might change our strategy, which might change our tactics, and that might influence what kind of progress we see. So that loop is going to continue, but that is a management practice. And your management is going to be, it can be over programs and it can be over personnel, but that is going to be a different type of leadership role in managing things than just a command and control of an incident. This is something that's ongoing and it has long-term impacts for the organization. So a lot of questions then, well, what's a supervisor? What's supervision? If that's management, how is management different than supervision? Well, you can be a manager and you might be a really good manager. You might be able to achieve the objectives and get the things done that the organization wants to have done, but you might be a horrible supervisor. You might be, or you might have the experience of having a horrible supervisor that is your boss, but it's somebody that you loathe coming to work every day. Because when we're talking about supervision focuses on personnel, and management is on achieving the tasks or the mission. So managing something is to achieve the goal. Supervision is how do the personnel do the tasks and things that the agency is asking them to do. And really this is coming down into the leadership and the personalities of the tasks and the assignments that are here. So what makes up supervision? Well, leadership is at the center, right? And one of the most important things of being a leader is actively listening to your personnel. You have to actively listen and hear what are their complaints, what are their needs, do they have the resources that they're needing to do the job that you're asking them to do. Effective confrontation, what do we mean by that? Well, effective confrontation is if you as a leader can observe your personnel and see that there's something not quite right in maybe how the employee is doing something, to have the courage to come in while it's small and something that you can easily correct, to go in and have that difficult conversation and correct the behavior while it's small and have that engagement and do it effectively, to where the employee doesn't feel like they've been yelled at or mistreated, that they leave with their dignity and they understand, oh, okay, what I really need to do an effective job here is change these two things. Conflict resolution, that could be between management and the employee. It could be employee to employee. It could be even customer and employee. There's lots of opportunities for conflict, but being able to effectively resolve conflict is a huge mission for the leader, the supervisor. If they see conflict within the work group and they ignore it, that is not an effective supervisor. And ultimately, the work group is going to suffer because of that. Communication, so obviously listening is a big part of communication, but speaking and providing instruction, whether that's written or verbal, or even, most of communication is nonverbal. How do you use your body language And how's that being translated by the person that's the audience? That's huge. If the supervisor is arrogant or rude or belittling in the way that they communicate to their work group, that is going to dramatically negatively impact how things get done or don't get done at all, or have high levels of turnover. It is not going to be good supervision. So communication is a critical component to having good supervision, but being a good leader as well. How you give and receive feedback, that is a challenging thing as a supervisor. You are a person just like anybody else. You're going to make mistakes. So how open is your supervisor, or if you are a supervisor, how open are you to receiving feedback? And then no one likes to be told that they're doing something wrong. So how gracious are you when you're providing that feedback? Do you do it in an appropriate way? And are you doing it for the right reasons and in the right tone? So giving and receiving feedback is also a critical component. And then mentorship. Very few organizations focus on mentorship. How are you developing the younger hires to, one, be skilled to advance in their career, but also have a desire to advance in their career? And are they understanding, the larger picture? This is why the agency is doing it this way, and this is how you fit into the overall mission. And we want to develop you because we see potential in you. You're going to be a great supervisor one day. But mentorship is something that a lot of organizations miss the boat on. But it's also a great supervisory leadership tool, because if you can mentor somebody to come along and be, the best version of themselves, it's also self-serving, right? Your job as a leader is made easier if the people that are working for you can do their job effectively and efficiently and without conflict. That makes the job of a supervisor much easier. So mentorship can be self-serving, but it shouldn't be done for those reasons. But it's also typically overlooked. So we covered three terms, and the three terms are very important, but they're also very different from each other. So command and control, I just want you to remember that's really incident or scene specific, and it's focusing on decision making. There's an emergent need for timely decisions to be made to control this thing, whatever that thing might be. We need to have somebody to be an incident commander that's going to make timely decisions to resolve whatever that is. Management is processes, programs, having a large vision, goals, and objectives. You're going to manage your resources to get to some sort of desired outcome. Different, yet again, is supervision. So, how are you going to supervise the people or the tasks, the performance? Do I need to have correction active plans to help, motivate or change how people are doing those things? And that requires leadership. So hopefully now you understand the differences between those three terms. But for police agencies, you're going to need all three when we look at those supervisor ranks. So the sergeant's going to have the ability to perform all three of these roles, often within the same type of an incident, because command and control doesn't happen in isolation of management or supervision. They're all working together, but there are three different priorities and tasks that will all be part of that leadership role. So earlier we looked at all the different types of ranks that exist in law enforcement, and then we just looked at what does leadership, command and control, management look like. So now I think we'll go through each of the types of ranks and the areas of responsibility. So there's, I think, some misconception on what does an officer do, what does a sergeant do, and I know there's misconception even within law enforcement as what does command do? They don't even do anything. So we'll kind of cover that here. So the areas of responsibility of an officer, we'll just take a typical call and kind of work through the series of events that they're going to be doing or what they'll be responsible for. So let's say there's a 911 call. We could be domestic violence. It could be a barking dog. It doesn't matter. there's going to be a 911 call that initiates some sort of a desired police response. So the officer is going to be dispatched to that call. The officer will respond. They're going to have to make decisions. Does that warrant an emergent response with lights and sirens? Is it more of a covert response? Or is this, we'll get to it in the priority of the other calls that are pending. So ultimately, they're going to get there. They're going to investigate whatever the scenario is. In most cases, there's going to have to be some sort of written disposition on what did the officer do, what were their observations, and what is the outcome. Is somebody getting a warning? Somebody getting arrested? Is it an infraction? Was there nothing there at all? But some sort of a written report is typically going to be required and entered into a record system so that the citizen and the agency knows what was actually handled. And then the officer is going to clear that call. So after the call is cleared, if you're that line level officer, your job is basically done. You're going to go to the next thing, or if that's the end of your shift, you're going to sign out of service and hopefully go enjoy some off time. But that's what basically line level officer on a basic routine call, if you will, would look like. So let's use the same call that our officer just went to, and we'll kind of look at it from the first line supervisor role or a sergeant role. So they're also going to be monitoring and hearing the 911 call. They're going to hear it be pushed out by the communications officer. But they're going to monitor the incident. They will listen, okay, my unit just arrived. Okay, they just said on the radio that it's all clear. They're going to clear with a report. So they'll listen and see if they're ever needed to respond to the scene for any kind of supervision, or if they need any assistance or additional units, that kind of stuff. Ultimately, so they hear that they're going to clear and there's going to be a report written. So that they're going to then look for that report. When they receive it, they're going to review it for elements of the crime, for obviously grammar, sentence structure, completeness, that it makes sense, that it covers what needs to be in a report, and it's accurate to the best of their knowledge. And if it is, then they will approve that. There might be various levels of approval needed. That's agency specific, but they'll review and approve reports. They're also going to look at incidents from the policy perspective to make sure, okay, was it appropriate? You ran code to that scene, but really that wasn't a priority call. And when you run code, that's dangerous. So they might have an opportunity to have a training moment or discussion with the officer. It's like, hey, on these types of calls, that doesn't actually warrant running code, and I'm concerned for your safety. So next time if something like that happens, don't run lights and siren to it. Just drive normal, obey all the traffic laws and respond. That might be a discussion that happens. Again, that goes to the supervisor role of a sergeant to look out for the safety of their officer, but also larger, they're a risk manager for the agency. They don't want there to be a collision and then have any kind of litigation or risks for the agency as well. So they're going to look at it from a policy perspective, make sure that the incident was handled, there wasn't any policy violations or administrative things that were concerning. And then a good supervisor will kind of do a minor after action review for the incident, and they'll determine, like, did we do everything appropriately? Is there anything that should have been done or could have been done better? Maybe that was a domestic violence call and they didn't have enough officers there to safely control the scene. So they might have an after action with the officers that were involved and say, hey, I'm glad everything worked out, but next time let's have more officers come. Or it might be something like, we had way too many officers, next time let's not call that many officers. But having an after action and really considering what could we do better is a really critical role that should be happening by the supervisor and by the unit that's doing the work. So now we're going to jump up into that command level. That might be the lieutenant, that might be captains or major or the chief. It really doesn't matter. Any of those command level roles will be doing the same types of these functions. So again, going back to the same situation that the officer responded to, they might be looking at it from a perspective, was that response time sufficient? Is that within our expectations for our community? Does our community expect the response time to be that fast, or they want it to be faster? So they might be looking at it from that perspective. When they look at that, they might be evaluating the staffing models. Like, wow, that response time was really slow, but we only had one officer working, so that's why. Or they might be looking at the response time and then say, wow, we had two other officers that were working, and why didn't they go to help out? That would have helped with the response time. So they're looking at it more as a programmatic review to make sure that is the agency doing the right types of staffing, and are they being responsible with the resources they have. They're also going to look at, was there adequate supervision provided? So they're going to look at the sergeant, and was it appropriate that the sergeant stayed in the office and managed that scene remotely from their office? Or did they go to the scene and they actually were on scene doing field supervision? So they're going to evaluate that. Was that done appropriately, and was that adequate? Are the reporting mechanisms sufficient? So again, you're looking at the larger processes that are at play. Yeah, that officer completed a report, but maybe there's still handwriting reports, and that took so long for the handwritten report to get revised and approved that now we missed a deadline for the courts. So maybe there's improvements that could be made in having something electronically submitted. Or maybe there's an electronic submission process that is taking too long, or doesn't get updated, or has to be updated manually. So they're going to look at those types of things. Then they'll evaluate policies. Is the policy, what the practice is of the officer, is that consistent with what our policy is? Laws change every legislative session. Are we consistent? Is our policy consistent with the new laws? So that's an evaluation process that's ongoing, and that's what the command level staff will be doing. And then finally, and probably most importantly, was the community well served? At the end of the day, when this call was cleared, did the citizen who called 911, or did the community groups that were watching externally, did they feel that they were well served by the police? And that is a critical component that needs to be done on each one of the cases. And if they weren't well served, what then should the agency be doing to better serve the community? How do they communicate back? Did the officer ever go back to the person who called 911 and let them know, hey, thank you for calling 911. This is, I can't get into maybe some of the sensitive information, but at the end of the day, this person was arrested. They were put into jail. Excuse me. Or it might be helpful for them to know that, hey, we responded and we did an investigation and we have an idea of who the suspect is, but we did a thorough search of the area. We couldn't find him. But we're going to assign that to a detective, and we're going to be doing follow-up, and here is the detective's business card. If you have any questions, you can reach them. If that's done, the community might feel well served. If that call is cleared and nobody ever went back to the reporting party to give them any information, they probably don't feel that anything was done, because nobody ever communicated back that they even responded. If they were on their way to go to work and they called 911 and then had to leave and go to work, so they never saw the police even respond, and maybe by the time they get home, nobody's around, the neighbors don't know anything, they have no idea if anything was ever done by the police. So their perspective on how the community was served might be different than what we described a moment ago. But that is a very critical command level role that goes back into, the command and control, the management, and the supervision aspects of policing, and all three of them need to be present so that the culture of the agency and is using the structure of the agency effectively to really be providing that service to the community. So you hopefully can see how they all are combining and influencing, at the end of the day, how the community is served or potentially not served. Another component when we look at organizational structure of police agencies, and again, supervision, how the agency is structured, is time management. And by time management, we can talk about, and we will talk about, lots of different components of time management. But for the purposes of this slide, we're going to look at police shifts. So if you have worked a night shift, then you're going to understand the illustration of this graphic pretty easily. If you've never worked a night shift, I would challenge you to stay up maybe over the weekend, one of the nights, and you'll understand this graph very clearly. That you're going to get very, very tired in a way unlike working during the daytime. When you work at night, it's just messing with your physical body is designed, even at the chemical level, the biological level, that when the sun goes down, the human body is telling itself, hey, it's time to go to bed. It's time to get some sleep. And when the sun rises, the opposite happens. And the body releases chemicals that tell us, hey, it's time to wake up. Let's go do things. So the degree of tiredness and sleepiness over time during night shift is represented by this illustration. So one of the time management considerations is the shift duration and the officer performance are always in competition of each other. The longer the shift goes that the officer is working, their performance is going to decrease. And that just makes sense, right? The longer you do any task, the likelihood that you're doing that task as well as when you first started is diminishing. So that is one of the organizational structures and management roles. Did the agency set itself up in a good way? Are the expectations on officers reasonable? If we're assigning somebody to work a 20-hour shift, but we're expecting them to maintain the same level of performance all 20 of those hours, is that reasonable? And that's a consideration the agency must make. And in the shift discussion, here's just an example of some very, very commonly seen police schedules. So you might work 5 8-hour shifts, you might work 4 10-hour shifts, or work like a hybrid where you work, 3 on, 4 off, 3 on, 4 off, 5 on, 5 off. There's a lot of variations in like the 12-hour shifts or some crazy 11-hour shifts, but you'll see that typically law enforcement, you're going to have day shift, you're going to have night shift, you might have swing shift or graves, lots of different types of shifts thrown in there. But the shift duration is something that the agency is going to set. That might be the chief, or that might be delegated down to the command or sergeant level on what they're going to assign their personnel. But considerations need to be made for, if it's night shift, the propensity to be tired. If you have, let's say, a young officer that has young children at home and they're trying to sleep during the daytime when the kids are now waking up, it's something to have the shift, but there's a great deal of supervision and understanding of, is this officer getting the type of rest that they need to be productive during the daytime or the nighttime when they're working. So there's a great deal of research and data on the different types of shift and which shift might be best. And I would say there's pros and cons with each of the shifts. If you work 5 8-hour shifts, your duration of work is less, but then the number of days off that you have each week is also less. But there's also an argument that people actually are coming back to work more tired from their weekend because people tend to spend their weekends staying up later or partying, that kind of thing. So then is it better to have only 2 days off, or is it better to have 3 days off? And then you have the work-life balance. Most people, if they've had 3 days off for a 3-day weekend, prefer that over only having 2 days, which people that work 12-hour shifts would even say having that additional day off is even more beneficial. But as a manager and a supervisor, you have to weigh that balance of, are we getting a return on investment because the productivity is continuing to be effective to the level that the agency wants, or is that diminished and maybe that 12-hour or that 10-hour shift is too long, we're not getting that return because people are too tired. So it's just something to consider. If you've never worked these shifts, just know that this is a constant consideration of most law enforcement supervisors and command level. There's, like I said, lots of research and studies that go on, and one study might indicate one thing, and then the next couple years, another study will come out and kind of contradict those findings. So it's continually changing and evolving, but something to be aware of. So we kind of talked about this in that consideration of what's the best shift for assigning officers to work. A huge consideration should be the morale of the employees, because if your department is only going to offer, let's say, 5 8-hour days, and let's say that the police officers in your community don't want to work 5 8-hour days, they would work 4 10s, and there's another neighboring department that only works 4 10s, and your agency is not willing to yield on that, that morale is going to be very low, and you might see staff move over and lateral over to that other agency. So morale is a very big consideration on the types of shifts and assignments that you provide. Staffing levels are another huge consideration. If you don't have enough staff to support that, if you work 5 8-hour shifts, you have more opportunities for coverage, but you also have to adjust, the type of schedule. You might have to have more shifts in the day to get the coverage. So staffing is going to be a huge concern. CBAs, the collective bargaining agreements, if your officers are likely part of some sort of a union. So what has already been agreed to in the collective bargaining agreements that you have to follow. A lot of the schedules and staffing is going to be dictated by what the bargaining agreement is already allowing for. Overtime costs, if you run any shift, especially night shift, when an officer is about to go home, but now they stop a car and that driver is DUI, you might run into a very large overtime costs. And so you might look at when not only the number of hours, but when your shifts are going to start and when they're going to stop to help reduce and mitigate the amount of overtime. Just money in general, you may not have the ability to offer some overtime shifts, or you might have money available, you don't have the staffing, so you have to offer additional shifts that you're going to fill on overtime. And a lot of the scheduling is going to be based off of call volume. You might have to stack more officers on weekend night shifts to cover the increase of calls, and then you can maybe reduce the staffing that you need during the daytime, or vice versa. It's just going to depend on the kind of community that you're in. So the illustration on the right, you have the constraints or the calls for service, the demands are pressuring the agency, and it's going to respond by the number of inputs that it has, the amount of effort that its officers can do, and just the sheer number of resources that it can commit to the schedule. So those two are always going to be in conflict with each other, but you're, at least as a supervisor, trying to find that harmony or balance to where you have enough officers or resources available to meet the demands for the need, and you're also not burning out your employees to where they want to still come to work and enjoy the work that they're doing. So the illustration we saw a few slides ago that had just the basic shifts where it's night shift, day shift, and you have some officers thrown on there. That is a great plan, but law enforcement is unpredictable. So not every call for service is going to be treated or handled or resolved the same way. So we have some illustrations of just some basic things that law enforcement is going to encounter. You might have uh, a felony traffic stop up at the top left where you're getting a suspect, looks like he might be resisting, and there might be somebody in the trunk. Um, that's probably not going to resolve super quickly. You can see an armored vehicle there, so it looks like it's a SWAT response. So that call is probably taking a couple hours. In the left middle, maybe a felony traffic stop, maybe that's just a stolen vehicle, and once they get the person in custody, call for a tow truck, and that can resolve itself somewhat quickly. Then you have another SWAT vehicle. Who knows the duration of getting the resources in place that will safely resolve that. And then once they're in custody, what happens then? Do they need to be interviewed by detectives? Is there a search warrant that needs to be written for the residence or vehicle? So you can see these can take, any one of these instances can expand beyond a normal traffic stop into a very lengthy, prolonged event. The motorcycle traffic stop, typically, a traffic stop, you could maybe resolve that in 5 minutes. You have maybe a domestic violence investigation there in the middle that will take hours. just to resolve at the scene, if you're doing a quality investigation, to make sure that the victim is feeling that they are adequately being protected and they're provided the resources that they're entitled to and required to get by law. And then the writing of the report and submitting of evidence, that's going to take a considerable amount of time. Then again, the picture in the lower center where detectives doing interviews, some interviews can take 8-10 hours taking breaks, but to get to building the rapport, to get critical information from an interview can take an extreme amount of time. And then, how much time does the agency dedicate to building those community relations and doing stakeholder engagement? That's not going to be accomplished quickly if it's going to be of any, meaningful way. So how an agency spends its time and what kinds of functions it's, using its time to complete kind of goes back to the organizational structure. What was the design? What's the chief executive officer? What are they delegating as a priority? And there's the saying, show me your checkbook and I'll show you what your priorities are, or show me your calendar and I'll tell you where your priorities are. It's just as true for law enforcement. If you're looking at, calculating the number of hours that a law enforcement agency spends doing any one of these functions, you can really see then what's organizationally important to them. If all of their time is spent doing traffic stops, and speed enforcement might be their priority. If all of their time is reactionary, then maybe they don't have resources to do any proactive traffic stops, or maybe that's just not a priority. Or if they don't have any time spent doing community relations, maybe that's not a priority. Or if they have a lot of time in the community, then that helps kind of demonstrate that. But the time and functions of law enforcement are very, very important, and they're not just linear. It's not easy to put on an Excel spreadsheet to schedule, because you have to know and make exceptions for prolonged incidents that could be unforeseen. So in summary, just remember what we covered. The organizational structure, it's important because it's going to allow the agency to be able to make timely decisions, or if it's overly built with bureaucracy, it's going to be delayed and timely decisions aren't going to be possible. That can influence in a large way what the organizational culture is. Understanding the significance of organizational culture, because that's going to be how the officers on the street are actually doing their jobs, and is that consistent with what the direction is from the chief. And then we covered in pretty good detail what leadership, supervision, and management are, how they're different, but all three of them are required for a police agency to be effective and to help serve its community. So we will see you in the rest of the module. Have a great week.